I'm Stella Harris, 31 years old, and every Thanksgiving of my life has felt more like a stage play than a holiday. The house smells like cinnamon and roasted turkey. The table gleams under soft light, and yet beneath all that polish there's tension so thick you could carve it with the same knife my father uses for the bird. This year I arrived later than usual, wearing calm-like armor. I'd promised myself I'd make it through dinner without shrinking back into the quiet shadow everyone expected me to be. But when my father raised his glass and said, "Your sister just bought a gorgeous home," I realized the script hadn't changed. Only I had. Before I tell you how that night turned everything upside down, take a moment to tell me where you're listening from, and if you've ever sat at a table where your worth was measured by someone else's yardstick, don't forget to like and subscribe. I grew up in a house where success was a family currency. My father believed in results, not effort. My mother believed in keeping the peace no matter what it cost. And my sister Kara, well, she was the family's headline act from the start. She won spelling bee scholarships, hearts, and applause with the ease of someone born under a spotlight. Every achievement she made became a family story, retold at dinners, weddings, even backyard barbecues. My victories, smaller and quieter, faded somewhere between the punchlines. I learned early that silence was easier than trying to compete with applause. Our childhood home sat on a tree-lined street in Savannah, Georgia, all brick charm and manicured hedges. My father's laughter carried through the rooms like background music, though it always sounded louder when he was proud of Kara. When I came home with a good report card, he'd nod, barely looking up from his paper. When Kara mentioned she was nominated for something, he'd open a bottle of wine. Mom would smile, that fixed smile of hers, adjusting a napkin or polishing silver, as if polishing could fix what she refused to see. By my mid-20s, Kara had everything my father ever praised: a corporate job, a husband, a mortgage, and a closet full of designer heels. I had a one-bedroom apartment with thrift store furniture, a head full of ideas, and a laptop that sometimes overheated if I worked past midnight. I told myself it didn't matter that I was building a different kind of life. But every holiday dinner was a reminder that different in our family meant less. When Dad would toast to Kara's promotions, his eyes would drift to me like a spotlight searching for something it couldn't find. "You'll get there," he'd say, smiling in that well-meaning way that felt more like a verdict. The guests would nod politely. I'd laugh, take a sip of wine, and make myself small enough to fit inside my chair. Even Mom's soft hand on my arm felt rehearsed a cue to stay gracious, to not ruin the mood. The thing is, I wasn't lazy or lost. I was working quietly, endlessly. I took on freelance contracts when no one thought I could, stayed up until dawn, drafting proposals, built something from nothing. But because my progress didn't come with milestones, they could display no big engagement, no sparkling keys to a new house. It went unseen. And with every Thanksgiving, I stopped sharing more of myself. There's only so many times you can tell your story to people who've already decided how it ends. By the time I turned 30, I'd skipped 2 family gatherings in a row. The first time I claimed a deadline, the second time I didn't bother explaining. That year I spent Thanksgiving alone in my apartment with a carton of takeout and a holiday movie marathon. It should have felt lonely. Instead, it felt like oxygen. Without the noise of comparison, I could finally hear my own thoughts. I realized that peace doesn't always mean harmony. Sometimes it means absence. In the quiet that followed, I began piecing together a life that no one asked about. I learned how to negotiate contracts, how to say no to clients who undervalued my time, how to invest wisely. The work was demanding, but for the first time, I wasn't chasing anyone's approval. My little consulting business grew slowly at first, then steadily enough to make me believe in it. I started saving, then buying, and before I knew it, I was holding the keys to a house I had paid for entirely on my own. No cosigner, no shared deed, no debt. I stood in that empty living room the day I moved in, sunlight spilling through wide windows, and thought, no one needs to clap for this but me. I kept it private, not secret, just sacred. I didn't post it, didn't announce it, didn't turn it into a story to be compared against someone else's. It was enough to know that I had built something solid, something mine. And yet, when the Thanksgiving invitation arrived again this year, a familiar hesitation crept in. Part of me wanted to decline to keep the peace of my new life untouched. but another part, quieter, stronger, whispered that maybe it was time to walk back into that house, not as the quiet one, not as the shadow, but as the woman I had become. So I pressed yes on the RSVP, booked my flight, and promised myself one thing: I wouldn't sit through another holiday pretending I hadn't already arrived. I didn't know it yet, but by the time dessert was served, one sentence would change the way they saw me forever. By the time Thanksgiving morning arrived, I already knew what kind of day it would be. The sky was clear, the air sharp with the scent of pine, and my mother's house sat gleaming like it always did this time of year. From the moment I stepped through the front door, everything felt choreographed. The laughter, the background music, the smell of buttered rolls warming in the oven. Nothing about it was new. Every holiday had been a polished performance since I could remember. Mom moved like a director behind the scenes, adjusting silverware, smoothing linens, and smiling that perfect hostess smile. My father's voice carried through the house rich and booming as he retold the same stories that had once charmed guests and now filled the silence between bites. At the center of it all, as always, was Kara. She had arrived earlier, dressed like she'd stepped out of a magazine, soft curls, bright lipstick, a dress that looked expensive without trying. She was the kind of woman who never had to announce success because everyone already expected it from her. Dad made sure of that. Every compliment, every story, every toast somehow circled back to her. It was never cruel, not outright. But the balance was always tipped in her favor, and everyone at the table had learned to live with that weight. I took a seat near the far end, the same one I'd always chosen, close enough to listen, but far enough to be overlooked. My cousin Abby leaned over and whispered that she was glad I came. Her warmth cut through the room's practiced chatter, but before I could thank her, Dad's voice rose again, commanding attention. He raised his glass, his tone cheerful and full of pride. "Your sister has some big news," he said, and a few relatives immediately leaned forward, already smiling. Kara's husband, Trevor, grinned like a man who had rehearsed his role. "We finally closed on the new house," he said. Dad's face lit up. 4 bedrooms, wraparound porch, even granite countertops. "She's always ahead of the curve." The room erupted in admiration, a chorus of impressed murmurs. I felt all eyes glance toward me, waiting for my reaction. It was the same unspoken ritual, Kara's triumph, first my silence second. Then Dad turned to me, his grin widening, his words wrapped in that teasing tone he used when he thought he was being playful. "So, Stella," he said, "when are you going to catch up?" The question hung in the air, light enough to pass as a joke, sharp enough to cut anyway. For years I had smiled through moments like that, finding refuge in polite laughter. But not this time. I met his eyes, steady and calm. "I did," I said, my voice even. "I just didn't invite anyone who doubts me." For a moment, no one moved. The hum of conversation fell away. Forks stopped midair. Wine glasses hovered untouched. I didn't rush to explain. I didn't smile to make it easier. I let the words stand there between us, quiet but solid. Dad blinked, unsure whether he'd heard me right. "You did?" I nodded. "About a year ago." He gave a quick laugh, the kind that tried to smooth over tension. "A house, huh?" "Yes," I said, lifting my water glass. "Just over 4,000 square feet. Paid in full." The silence deepened, almost physical. Aunt Carol's mouth opened slightly as if she were searching for the right words. Even Trevor, who usually had something to say, stared at his plate. Mom's hand froze, mid-pour cider glinting in the glass. Dad leaned back, a puzzled smile flickering across his face. "That's a lot of space for someone living alone," he said. Maybe I answered, but when you buy it outright, space isn't really a burden. Across the table, Kara's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Her expression stayed neutral, but I could see the flicker in her eyes, surprise, maybe disbelief. For the first time in years, she didn't have a ready line. Mom finally spoke, her voice softer than usual. "Why didn't you tell us I looked at her not unkindly? It never came up." That answer landed harder than I expected. The table seemed to tilt with the weight of it. No one reached for the next dish. No one picked up where the conversation had left off. For once, the silence wasn't mine to fill. Trevor cleared his throat. "So where is it?" He asked, his voice trying to sound casual. About 20 minutes from here, I said. Buttering a roll. Dad's chuckle sounded forced this time. Well, I'll be. You really went and did it. He tried to reclaim control, but something had shifted. I could see it in the way his eyes searched my face, as if he were meeting me for the first time. That's wonderful, honey, Mom said, though her voice trembled. Really wonderful. Thank you, I said simply. Kara leaned forward slightly, her tone sugar-coated but tight. Buying a house is a big deal. You didn't want to share that with your family. You mean the family that only ever asks how close I am to being like you? I asked quietly. Her smile faltered. That's not fair. Neither was pretending the only version of success worth celebrating was yours, I said. There was no bitterness in my tone, just fact. Dad shifted in his chair. Well, Kara's place is in a great neighborhood, wonderful schools, strong market value. Although technically, I said lightly, it's not her name on the deed. The room froze again. Kara blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me, it's public record, I said. Trevor signed the mortgage. Trevor's face flushed. We're married. It's our house. Of course, I replied evenly. But banks don't care about vows. They care about names. Kara's jaw tightened. Why would you even look that up? I didn't, I said. Someone sent it to me. They thought it was funny how I kept being compared to you when I was the only one not owing a bank anything. Dad raised a hand. All right, that's enough. It's not enough, I said softly. It's just honest. For a moment I thought he might stand up, that the old authority in his voice might return. But it didn't. He looked at me, really looked, and I saw something I'd never seen before, doubt. Kara crossed her arms. I never asked to be compared. Neither did I said. But it happened every year, every holiday, every backhanded compliment. The air in the room grew still. Even the sound of the refrigerator in the next room felt too loud. I built something real. I continued. I just didn't need an audience for it. No one spoke, not even Mom. I could see her eyes glisten, but she didn't say a word. Finally, Dad leaned forward, his voice low. Why didn't you just tell us, Stella? Because it wouldn't have mattered, I said. You decided who I was a long time ago. You put me in a box labeled still trying and never looked inside. That's not fair, he said quietly. It's not about fair, I answered. It's about patterns. Kara looked down at her plate, her fingers tightening around her napkin. I turned toward her. You're not the villain here, but you never once used your voice to shift the spotlight. You just stood there soaking it all in, never asking why it was always one-sided. I didn't know, she said, under her breath. You didn't ask, I replied. Mom's voice trembled. Stella, I didn't realize. I know, I said gently. That's the problem. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that came before. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. For once, there was no laughter to smooth it over, no story to distract from what had been said. It was all out there now, raw and unpolished. I folded my napkin neatly and placed it beside my plate. I think I'll head out, I said quietly. Stella, Mom began, but stopped herself. I looked at her calm and steady. You always asked me to come back, but never asked how I was doing, I said. You wanted updates you could brag about, not the truth of who I was becoming. Her mouth parted, but no sound came out. I turned to Kara. We don't have to be close, but it would have meant something if you'd asked how I was doing once in a while. No filters, no audience. Kara didn't speak, but her eyes glistened. Finally, I faced Dad. You wanted me to catch up, I said. But I was never behind. You just never looked. He exhaled slowly, shoulders sagging. You're right, he said quietly. I nodded, slipped on my coat and walked to the door. The cold air met me as I stepped outside. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small walking away from that house. The night was still, the air crisp, and as I breathed it in, one thought settled in my chest. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of finally being free to be seen. The night after Thanksgiving felt strangely still. I sat in my car outside my house, hands resting on the steering wheel long after the engine shut off. The porch light flickered against the dark windows, soft and steady, like it was waiting for me. I hadn't expected the dinner to unfold the way it did, but I also wasn't sorry. The silence at that table had said everything words never could. Inside my house smelled faintly of cedar and coffee grounds, the familiar calm I'd built for myself. I slipped off my coat, hung it by the door, and just stood there for a moment. No tension, no spotlight, just peace. The next morning, sunlight poured through the kitchen windows, catching on the stack of paperwork I'd left on the counter. I poured a cup of coffee and sat down at the table where my laptop waited. The quiet felt different now, lighter somehow. My business had grown in ways I hadn't slowed down to notice. 6 retainer clients, 3 proposals pending, a small team that trusted me enough to follow my lead. I had built something real, something solid, even if no one in my family had ever asked about it. For years I'd measured myself against the wrong ruler, trying to fit into a shape that never suited me. Now I was building a life that finally fit. Later that day I called Abby. She picked up almost immediately, her voice warm. "I've been waiting for you to call," she said. "That was something last night." I let out a quiet breath. "Yeah, I didn't mean to cause a scene." Abby laughed softly. "You didn't. You told the truth, and they didn't know what to do with it." We talked for nearly an hour about work, about family, about how strange it felt to stop apologizing for your own success. She told me she'd noticed the shift in me months ago. "You carry yourself differently now," she said. "It's not anger, it's calm." That night I went through some old boxes I'd stored in the guest room mementos from college early client files, photos from the years when I was still trying to prove myself. There were pictures of Kara's engagement party, her baby shower, her first home. I was there in most of them, smiling at the edges of the frame, always present, but never the subject. I slid those photos into an envelope and tucked them away. It wasn't resentment, it was release. Those moments had served their purpose. I didn't need to keep reminding myself where I'd once stood. By Sunday, the messages started coming in, first from Mom. "I wish things hadn't gone the way they did. Call me when you're ready." Then from Dad. "You caught me off guard, but I'm proud of what you've built." The last one came from Kara. "I didn't mean to make you feel small. I didn't know." I read each message carefully, my thumb hovering over the screen, but I didn't reply. Not yet. I needed time to sit with the words to believe them, or maybe to let them settle into the quiet where they belonged. Monday morning, I went back to work as usual. My home office was tucked behind French doors overlooking the backyard. The first winter frost had touched the trees overnight, leaving silver on every branch. I answered emails, reviewed contracts, and jumped on 2 video calls before noon. When I shut my laptop at the end of the day, I realized how different my life had become. My success didn't roar. It didn't demand attention. It moved quietly, steadily, like the hum of a machine that never needed to prove it was working. That evening, Abby stopped by with a pie she'd rescued from the family leftovers. "You left too soon," she teased. "Everyone was in shock after you walked out." I smiled. I figured. She leaned against the counter, studying me. "You know, I think it finally hit them. You weren't angry, you were done." Her words lingered as we shared the last slices of pie. Done didn't mean gone. It meant boundaries. It meant peace that didn't need validation. Later that week, I got a call from one of my new clients, a nonprofit director named Elaine Roberts. Her organization focused on small business mentorship for women rebuilding after divorce or layoffs. She wanted me to lead their strategy and outreach. "You've built exactly what we want to teach," she said. "Resilience without spectacle." Her words stopped me for a moment. That phrase, resilience without spectacle, summed up everything I'd been trying to live. I accepted the project on the spot. Days turned into weeks. I settled into a new rhythm, one that felt whole. I started hosting small workshops in town, helping women manage freelance transitions and budgeting. Nothing fancy, no big announcements, just real people learning from each other. One evening after a session ended, a woman my mother's age came up to me. "I've been where you were," she said softly. "When your family can't see you until you stop asking to be seen." Her words stayed with me long after she left. By December Christmas, invitations began circulating. The group text from Mom buzzed with talk of dinner menus, travel plans, and gift exchanges. Kara chimed in with cheerful emojis and photos of her decorated tree. I read every message but didn't respond right away. Abby called that night. "You thinking about going?" she asked. I hesitated. "I don't know. I'm not angry anymore. I just don't know if I'm ready to go back." She paused. "Maybe you don't need to go back the same way. Maybe you just need to walk in as the version of yourself you built." I thought about that as I sat by the window watching snow fall across the yard. For years, I'd defined family as something I had to earn. Now it felt like something I could choose on my own terms. The thought didn't hurt anymore. It felt like freedom. A few days later, a small package arrived on my doorstep. Inside was a handwritten note from Mom and a framed photograph from last Thanksgiving, the one taken before dinner started. Everyone was smiling, the table set perfectly. And there I was, standing slightly behind Kara, half in shadow. Mom's note was brief. "I didn't realize how often I left you out of the frame. I see it now." I set the frame on the counter and stared at it for a long while. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a start. I picked up my phone, typed a short message back. "I see it too. Thank you." That night, I sat on the porch with a blanket and a cup of tea, watching the last of the snow melt under the streetlight. Somewhere inside the weight I'd carried for years, the one built from comparison and quiet disappointment, finally lifted. I didn't know what the next holiday would look like, or if things with my family would ever return to normal. But maybe that was the point. Normal had never really worked. As I finished my tea, a faint smile found its way to my lips. The world around me was calm, still, and wide open. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was walking away from something. I was walking toward it, whatever came next. Winter came quickly that year, the kind that painted rooftops white by dawn and made the air smell faintly of pine and smoke. I spent most mornings in my office, coffee steaming beside the keyboard, while frost etched quiet patterns across the window. Work had been steady, busier than I'd expected, really. Between new contracts and the nonprofit project with Elaine Roberts, my days felt full in the right kind of way. For the first time, I didn't measure productivity by how it looked from the outside. I just worked, breathed, and let the rhythm of my own life finally make sense. By mid-December, holiday messages started flooding my phone again. Photos of decorated trees, family recipes, and endless reminders of traditions I used to brace myself for. I hadn't decided whether I'd join Christmas dinner. Mom's message had been gentle but cautious, written like someone testing the temperature of still water. "We'd love to have you, sweetheart. No pressure, just family." Even Dad had sent a short note a few days later, his words clipped but honest. "It would mean a lot if you came." I didn't answer right away. The memory of last Thanksgiving lingered, those silent faces, that shifting air, and I wasn't sure if going back meant healing or reopening something that had barely begun to close. A week later, I stopped by Abby's house to drop off a few gifts for her kids. Her living room smelled like cinnamon and vanilla candles, warm and alive. She poured 2 mugs of cider and handed me one with a grin. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" she asked. I didn't have to ask what she meant. "I don't know if I can handle another holiday like that," I said. Abby leaned back in her chair. "Maybe it won't be like that this time. Maybe they heard you." I stared into the cup, watching the steam rise. "And if they didn't?" She smiled softly. "Then at least you'll know you showed up for yourself, not for them." That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the framed photo Mom had mailed, the one where I stood half in shadow behind Kara. Her note had been an apology wrapped in acknowledgement, and though it didn't erase years of silence, it meant something. I picked up my phone and typed a short message to her. "I'll come for dinner. Just dinner." The reply came within minutes. "That's all we need." When Christmas Eve arrived, snow blanketed the street, softening the world into quiet. I parked down the block and walked up to the house, the porch light glowing amber against the cold. Inside the house looked the same, warm, carefully arranged, full of familiar scents. Mom met me at the door, her eyes glossy with relief. "You look beautiful," she said, pulling me into a hug that lasted longer than usual. Dad appeared from the living room, his voice softer than I remembered. "Stella." "I'm glad you're here." He didn't try to make small talk, and for once that was enough. Kara was in the kitchen arranging appetizers on a silver tray. When she looked up, I caught the flicker of hesitation in her eyes before she smiled. "Hey," she said quietly. "Hey," I replied. There was no tension in my voice, just calm acknowledgement. She gestured toward the counter. "I made that spinach dip you used to like. It wasn't much, but it was something." Dinner unfolded with an unfamiliar gentleness. Dad didn't fill the silence with stories. Mom didn't rush to smooth every pause. Abby, who had joined with her husband and kids, helped keep conversation steady, steering it towards safe groundwork, travel plans, even childhood memories. At one point, Kara turned to me, her tone cautious. "I saw that nonprofit project you're leading. It's been in the local news." I nodded. "Yeah, it's been good. We're mentoring about 30 women so far." She smiled, and for the first time in a long while it reached her eyes. "That's amazing, Stella. Really." The compliment caught me off guard, but I accepted it without suspicion. "Thanks," I said. "It feels good to build something that matters." Later, while everyone lingered near the tree, Dad handed me a small box. "It's not much," he said, his voice low. Inside was a simple leather notebook with my initials embossed on the cover. "For your ideas," he added. I ran my thumb over the lettering, the texture grounding me. "Thank you," I said. He nodded, a quiet acknowledgement passing between us that words couldn't fill. After dessert, Mom pulled out an old family album I hadn't seen in years. Most of the photos were of holidays, long past birthdays, graduations, and the summers we used to spend by the lake. In one picture, Kara and I were sitting on the dock, our feet dangling over the water, laughing at something out of frame. Mom traced a finger over the image. "You were both so close once," she said softly. The room went still. Kara's voice broke the silence first. "I'd like that again," she said. Her tone was unguarded, almost shy. I met her eyes. So would I. The rest of the night unfolded quietly. There were no grand speeches, no sudden reconciliations, just small, steady gestures that felt real. When I finally stood to leave, Mom walked me to the door, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You didn't have to, but you did." I smiled. "I'm glad I did." The drive home was slow, the road slick with new snow. Streetlights reflected off the windshield like faint stars. I thought about how much had changed, not the grand sweeping kind of change, but the slow, necessary kind. The kind that starts with a single truth spoken out loud and continues quietly afterward, reshaping everything in its path. When I reached my driveway, I sat in the car for a while, listening to the hum of the engine. The house looked warm from the outside golden light spilling through the windows. It struck me how much I had built brick by brick, moment by moment, a life I didn't have to defend. The peace wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Inside, I set the notebook on my desk and opened it to the first blank page. The paper was smooth under my hand. I wrote one line at the top, "Resilience without spectacle." The phrase from Elaine echoed in my mind, a reminder of how far I'd come. I didn't need the spotlight. I just needed to keep walking forward, steady and sure. Outside, the snow kept falling soft against the windows. I sat there for a long while, listening to the quiet, knowing this was only the beginning of something new, something that no longer required permission to exist. The distance between who I had been and who I was now felt wide but not lonely. It felt earned, and for the first time, I was ready for whatever came next. January brought with it the quiet kind of cold that seeps into everything, the kind that makes the house feel bigger, emptier somehow. The holidays had ended, but something about that night at my parents' house kept replaying in my mind. The small moments, the way Mom had touched my arm when I walked in, how Dad had looked at me without speaking, the way Kara's voice had softened when she asked about my work. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was movement. And movement after years of stillness felt like progress. I threw myself into work again, finding comfort in structure. My mornings started before sunrise, laptop open, coffee mug warm between my hands. The nonprofit partnership had turned into something much larger than I expected. Elaine, the director, called one morning with a tone that carried both excitement and exhaustion. "We've been awarded a state grant," she said. "We can expand the mentorship program statewide. I want you to lead the rollout." I was quiet for a moment, trying to take in what that meant. "You're serious?" I asked. "Completely," she said. "You built this model. It should be yours to grow. The next few weeks moved fast. Meetings filled my calendar, interviews were scheduled, and local papers started running features about the expansion. One afternoon, a reporter named Maggie Brooks called asking if I'd be willing to share my personal journey. "Your story could inspire a lot of women," she said. The thought of going public with something I'd built so privately gave me pause. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that," I said carefully. She laughed lightly. "You're exactly the right person. We're not looking for a headline. We're looking for honesty." When the article ran 2 weeks later, I almost didn't recognize myself in print. The headline read, "Quiet Success, Local Consultant Builds Mentorship Network for Women Starting Over." It was simple, dignified, and real. Abby dropped off a copy that morning, still folded to the story. "You made it," she said, smiling, and not the kind of "made it" they measure at your family table. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Saw your article. I'm proud of you. We both are." A second message followed a minute later, this one from Dad. "Impressive work, Stella. Maybe we can talk sometime about what you're doing." I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back, "I'd like that." 2 days later, Dad called. It had been years since I'd heard his voice sound unsure. "I read that piece twice," he said, his tone deliberate. "You've built something real." There was no trace of the teasing humor he usually used when he felt out of depth. "Thank you," I said softly. There was a short silence before he continued. "I think I mistook quiet for struggle." I shouldn't have. The words landed with a weight I hadn't expected. "We all see things differently when we stop looking through habit," I said. He chuckled faintly. "Maybe it's time I learn a few new ones." That conversation changed more than I realized in the moment. A week later, Mom invited me over for Sunday dinner. "Just the 4 of us," she said. "No guests, no fanfare." I agreed, cautiously hopeful. When I arrived, the house felt different. No polished centerpiece, no rigid seating plan, just soft light and the smell of baked rosemary chicken. Kara greeted me at the door, dressed simply, her hair pulled back. "Hey," she said almost nervously. "I made dessert." Dinner was awkward at first, as if everyone was waiting to see who would speak first. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. "I've been following that nonprofit online," he said. "The work you're doing, it's impressive." Kara looked up from her plate. "I saw it too," she added quietly. "It's really good, Stella. You should be proud." The compliment sounded genuine, even if slightly unfamiliar coming from her. Halfway through dessert, Mom asked if I'd consider coming by the house more often. "Not for holidays," she said. "Just dinner or coffee. We miss you." I didn't answer right away. "I can try," I said finally, "one step at a time." That seemed to be enough. When I left that night, Kara followed me to the front door. "You know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't realize how much I'd been living by Dad's approval until you stopped needing it." I looked at her, surprised by the honesty in her tone. "It's hard to see it when you're in it," I said. She nodded. "Yeah, I think I'm still learning." The weeks that followed brought small, steady changes. Mom started calling every few days, not to check in on accomplishments, but to ask simple things: recipes, garden tips, movie recommendations. Dad began showing up at community events where I spoke, standing quietly at the back, always leaving before the crowd thinned. I never called him out for it, but I noticed. It was his way of showing support without taking the spotlight. One afternoon, Kara called unexpectedly. "I'm near your office," she said. "Mind if I stop by?" She arrived 10 minutes later, carrying 2 coffees. "I wanted to see what your world looks like," she said, glancing around the bright, neatly organized space. We sat by the window as she asked questions about my work. Real questions this time. When she mentioned that one of her colleagues was looking for mentorship opportunities, I handed her a pamphlet from the nonprofit. "We have open enrollment next quarter," I said. She smiled, folding it carefully. "Maybe I'll volunteer," she said. "Coach a few sessions." I nodded. That'd be a good start. For the first time, the distance between us didn't feel hostile. It just felt like space room to rebuild. That night, as I locked up the office, I thought about how far everything had come. There hadn't been a single defining moment that fixed everything. No grand apology, no tearful reunion, just a series of quiet choices made differently than before. I understood then that justice, at least in families, rarely arrives like a verdict. It arrives like a slow thaw after a long winter, subtle, steady, almost imperceptible, until one day you realize the ice is gone. When I got home, I lit a candle in the living room and watched the flame dance against the glass. My phone buzzed with a message from Elaine, a reminder about an upcoming speaking engagement at the state conference. "You'll do great," she wrote. "Women need to hear this story." I smiled at the screen, thinking about what I'd say, how to talk about building something from silence, about reclaiming your own measure of worth. Outside, the last trace of snow had melted into soft earth. The world was turning again, quietly but surely. I didn't know what the next season would bring, but for the first time, I wasn't bracing for the next comparison or the next question about catching up. I'd already arrived, and now I was learning how to stay. As I closed the curtains, a light wind stirred outside, rustling the bare branches near the window. The sound was gentle, like the faintest reminder of everything that had shifted. Somewhere in that stillness, I knew the story wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about living fully without permission. And that realization felt like the truest kind of peace. The conference hall in Raleigh was larger than I expected. Rows of soft blue chairs stretched toward a stage, framed by tall windows and winter light. It was early March, and the air outside carried that first trace of spring, the kind that feels more like a promise than a change. I arrived the night before the event, checked into the hotel, and spent the evening reviewing my notes. I'd given plenty of presentations before, but this one was different. It wasn't just about strategy or numbers. It was about the path that led here, the quiet work, the resilience, the rebuilding. When morning came, the air hummed with energy. Dozens of women from across the state gathered in the lobby. Entrepreneurs, teachers, small business owners, each one carrying her own story. Elaine found me backstage just before my session. "You ready?" she asked. I smiled, though my hands were still. "As ready as I'll ever be." She squeezed my shoulder. "Just speak from where it hurts. That's where people listen." When I stepped onto the stage, the lights softened and the room grew still. I talked about what it meant to build quietly, to work without recognition, and to stop measuring worth by someone else's scale. I told them about the early mornings and the years of invisibility, about learning that success isn't always loud. By the time I finished, the room was silent for a breath, then filled with gentle applause. Not the wild, showy kind, just real steady appreciation. Afterward, a woman about my mother's age approached me. "You said something I needed to hear," she told me. "My daughter's been struggling, and I think I've been looking at her all wrong." Her eyes watered and she took my hand. "Thank you." Moments like that reminded me why I'd started all this in the first place. The following week, things moved fast again. The state partnership opened doors to neighboring programs, and my phone filled with requests, consultations, interviews, mentoring sessions. Abby stopped by one evening with a takeout dinner and laughed when she saw my dining table covered in folders. "You're running an empire," she said. "More like a one-woman marathon," I replied, smiling. In the middle of that momentum, I got a call from Mom. Her voice was light but uncertain. "Your father and I were thinking," she began. "Maybe we could come to your next event. We'd like to see what you do." I paused, surprised by the offer. "Of course," I said slowly. "It's in 2 weeks at the Civic Center. I'll send you the details." When I hung up, I sat for a moment, letting it sink in. 2 weeks later, I arrived early to prepare. The event wasn't as large as the conference, just a regional networking session, but still important. As I stood near the registration table, I saw them walk in. Dad in a neatly pressed blazer, Mom clutching her purse like she wasn't sure where to stand. They looked out of place but determined. When they spotted me, Mom smiled first. "This is beautiful," she said softly. Dad nodded, glancing around the room. Impressive setup. During my talk, I caught sight of them in the third row, sitting side by side. Mom's eyes followed every word. Dad's hands were clasped in his lap, his expression unreadable. When it ended, they both stood clapping quietly. As the crowd began to mingle, Dad stepped forward. "You have something real here," he said. "You built all this yourself." His tone carried no doubt, no edge, just recognition. Mom reached for my arm. "We're proud of you, Stella." Later that night, we went out to dinner, just the three of us. It wasn't fancy, just a quiet diner off the highway, but something about it felt new. Conversation came easier this time. Dad asked questions about the women I worked with, the funding model, even the challenges I faced. When the check came, he insisted on paying. "For once, let me contribute to something you built," he said with a small grin. It wasn't much, but it was his way of saying he saw me now. The following morning, I woke up to an email from Kara. The subject line read, "Proud of you." She'd attached a link to a local article about the event. "You're really doing it," she wrote. "I shared it with my team. They loved your story." I stared at the message for a while before replying, "Thank you. It means a lot." Over the next month, Kara and I started talking more. Nothing deep at first, simple things like her asking for advice about a work project or me sending her a recipe. Then one afternoon, she called with a tone I hadn't heard before. "I wanted to tell you something," she said. "Trevor and I are thinking about selling the house." I was quiet for a moment. "Oh," she exhaled. "We can't really afford it anymore. Between his job changes and the mortgage, it's been hard. I think I was so focused on keeping up an image that I didn't see how far we were stretching. There was no judgment in me, only understanding. That takes courage to admit," I said. "You'll figure it out." She hesitated. "I think I'm just tired of pretending everything's perfect." Her words hung between us, honest and fragile. "Then maybe this is your chance to start over," I said gently. "On your own terms." After we hung up, I sat by the window watching the sun dip behind the trees. For years, I'd envied the ease of her life, not realizing it had its own cracks beneath the surface. Maybe in her own way, she'd been living inside a kind of silence, too. A week later, she visited me for the first time. She brought a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, and we sat on the porch, the evening air warm and quiet. "Your place is beautiful," she said. "Peaceful." I smiled. "That's what I wanted." She glanced around, her voice softer. "I can see why you didn't invite anyone before. It feels safe here." We talked for hours about childhood, about how differently we saw the same home, about the quiet ache that comes from never feeling enough. At one point, she reached over and took my hand. "You were right, she said. "I didn't use my voice when it mattered." I met her eyes. "You're using it now." By the time she left that night, the distance between us felt smaller than it had in years. When I closed the door behind her, I realized something had shifted again, not just between me and her, but in the whole story that had started at that Thanksgiving table. The next morning, I received a message from Elaine. "We've been invited to Washington for a national roundtable on women's entrepreneurship. They want you to represent the program." I read the words twice, then smiled. It was the kind of opportunity I never would have imagined a few years ago. That evening, as the sky turned to gold outside my window, I thought about the journey ahead. About the long road from being the quiet one at the table to the woman being invited to speak at the table. And somehow, it all made sense now. Every silence, every small step, every quiet act of endurance had led here. I closed my laptop and walked out to the porch, the breeze cool against my skin. Somewhere in the distance, wind chimes rang softly, and I thought about what Elaine had told me once, how growth rarely announces itself with noise. It happens in the still moments, in the spaces where you finally learn to take up room. And though I didn't know what Washington would bring, I knew I was ready. For the first time in my life, I wasn't walking toward anyone's approval. I was walking toward my own future. Washington felt different from anywhere I'd ever been. The air carried a quiet pulse of movement, people rushing between meetings, conversations spilling from coffee shops, taxis flashing past glass towers. When Elaine and I arrived for the National Roundtable, the building itself felt like a statement, tall, bright, and open sunlight pouring through walls of glass. It was early April, the cherry blossoms just starting to fade soft petals, scattered across the sidewalks like confetti left over from something worth celebrating. We were met by a coordinator named Grace, who led us through security and into the main hall. Tables were arranged in a perfect circle, nameplates in front of each chair, microphones glinting under recessed light. "You'll speak third," Grace said kindly, handing me a folder. "You'll do fine. You wouldn't be here if you weren't meant to be." I nodded, trying to steady the quiet rush of nerves in my chest. Elaine leaned closer as we took our seats. "You don't have to be perfect," she whispered. "You just have to be honest." When the moderator called my name, I stood and walked to the podium, papers in hand, though I hardly looked at them. I spoke about how invisible work builds visible change, about how women rebuild entire lives from small, consistent choices. I mentioned the women in our program, how they taught me that progress doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just persists. When I finished, the applause came slow but strong. A few women rose to their feet. Elaine's eyes glistened as she clapped her expression, saying everything words couldn't. For the first time, I felt what it meant to be seen not as someone's daughter, not as a sibling, but as a woman standing entirely in her own name. That evening, the program hosted a dinner at a quiet restaurant near DuPont Circle. Long tables stretched beneath chandeliers, candles flickering in tall glass holders. Elaine sat beside me, laughing softly as we listened to others share their stories. When it was my turn, I thanked her. "You gave me a chance to use my voice," I said. "I think I forgot I had one for a while." She smiled. "No," she said gently. "You just needed someone to remind you it was already there." The next morning before our flight home, I stood by the hotel window watching the sunrise over the city. The light caught the edge of the Washington Monument, pale gold against the sky. I thought about that Thanksgiving night months ago, the way my father's voice had filled the room, the silence that followed the sentence that changed everything. Back then I had spoken to reclaim my worth. Now I spoke to uplift others. That difference mattered more than I could explain. When I returned home, life fell back into rhythm. But something within me had shifted. Emails flooded in from other states asking about collaboration. One message came from a journalist at a national outlet requesting an interview for a feature on women transforming local economies. Elaine called later that week. "You'll have to get used to the spotlight," she teased. "You've earned it." I laughed. I'll try to keep it from feeling too loud. A few days later, my phone buzzed with a call from Dad. "Your mom and I watched your talk online," he said. "You looked confident, like you've been doing it your whole life." I smiled. "Thank you." There was a pause before he added, "I sent it to your aunt. She said she finally understands what you do." His tone carried quiet pride, the kind that didn't need to be performed. That weekend, Kara came over again, this time with a folder under her arm. "I have something for you," she said, setting it on the table. Inside were sketches and layouts for a rebranding proposal. "I thought your organization could use a refresh, new colors, a logo, maybe a website redesign. I'd love to help." I looked at her, surprised. "You'd want to work on this?" She nodded. "I think it's time I used my skills for something that feels good, not just looks good." We spent hours going through ideas, the kind of creative back and forth we'd never had growing up. Somewhere between the design notes and shared laughter, I realized we weren't competing anymore. We were collaborating, two women learning what it meant to meet in the middle. Later that evening, after she left, I sat outside with a cup of tea, the night air soft and full of crickets. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Abby. "Your family's changing, Stella. I can see it." I typed back, "Maybe we all are." Spring moved quickly after that. The program officially expanded to 5 new regions, and I was invited to consult with the governor's task force on women-owned business development. At one event, Mom showed up unannounced, sitting quietly in the back row. Afterwards, she waited by the door holding her coat and smiling. "I wanted to see you in your element," she said. "I finally understand why you stayed quiet for so long. You were building this." Her voice wavered just slightly. I reached out and hugged her. "I'm glad you came," I said. The drive home that night felt different. The road stretched ahead, clear and calm, headlights cutting through soft fog. I thought about how long it had taken to reach this point, the misunderstandings, the silence, the distance, and how none of it had been wasted. Every quiet effort, every lonely season had built the foundation I was standing on now. By late May, the air was warmer and my calendar was full. Still, one Saturday morning, I set everything aside and drove out to the lake where our family used to spend summers. The water shimmered under the sun, gentle waves brushing the shore. I walked to the old wooden dock, the boards creaking under my feet, and sat down with my shoes dangling above the water. After a while, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw Kara walking toward me carrying a paper bag. "Mom said you'd be here," she said. "I brought lunch." She sat beside me, pulling out sandwiches and a pair of sodas. We ate in quiet comfort, watching the light dance on the surface of the lake. "You know," she said after a while, "Dad told me he wants to turn part of the old property into a retreat center, something for women starting new careers. He said it was your idea." I smiled faintly. It was a thought. "I didn't think he'd actually do it." She nudged me lightly. "He's even calling it Harris Haven." The name made me laugh. "That sounds like him." She looked at me, her expression soft. "He's trying, Stella. We all are." I nodded, feeling the truth of that settle somewhere deep. "I know." For a long while, neither of us spoke. The wind carried the scent of pine and the sound of distant birds. Somewhere in the stillness, the years between us felt smaller, lighter. When we stood to leave, Kara slipped her arm around my shoulders just briefly. "You're not invisible anymore," she said quietly. I looked at her and smiled. I never was. I just needed to stop waiting for someone else to notice. We walked back toward the cars, the gravel crunching underfoot, the sunlight breaking through the trees in thin golden lines. Ahead of us, the road curved gently out of sight, leading somewhere neither of us could fully see yet, but for once we were walking it together. And as the breeze caught my hair and the lake glimmered behind us, I knew something for certain. The story that began in silence had become one of recognition, and this time no one would ever mistake quiet for smallness again. The following summer arrived softer than most. The air carried that calm sweetness of something well-earned, the kind that comes after years of fighting to be heard. My days were slower now, but full in their own way. I'd settled into a rhythm that felt grounded. The nonprofit continued to grow new branches opening across the country, and yet what I valued most weren't the headlines or panels. It was the people, the women who sat across from me during workshops, eyes tired but hopeful, realizing for the first time they didn't need permission to rebuild. One afternoon, I drove out to my parents' home for Sunday lunch. It had been months since that day by the lake, and the house looked different, somehow lighter. The walls were filled with framed photos, including one from the Round Table in Washington. Mom had printed it herself, and when I noticed it hanging in the hallway, she smiled. "You've brought pride to this family, Stella," she said softly. "Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that lasts." Dad grilled outside while Kara set the table. It felt natural, almost like the way things might have been if we'd understood each other sooner. As we sat down to eat, Dad raised his glass of iced tea. "To starting over," he said, "and to the courage it takes to keep doing it." We clinked glasses, simple and steady. No performance, no spotlight, just a family that had finally learned how to see one another. After lunch, Kara asked if I could step outside with her. The sun hung low, scattering gold through the trees. "We sold the house last week," she said quietly. "It was hard, but I feel lighter." I smiled. "That's a good sign." She nodded. "I also joined your mentorship program as a volunteer." Her words caught me off guard, but in the best way. "Really?" I asked. "Really," she said. I figured it was time I stopped talking about change and started helping it. I hugged her, the kind of hug that ends years of distance without needing words. A few evenings later, I sat on my porch watching the fireflies drift above the grass. The hum of the world felt softer, like it had found its balance again. I thought about how far I'd come from that Thanksgiving night, the one where everything cracked open. Back then, I thought speaking up was the ending, but it turned out to be the beginning. What came after was harder, quieter, and far more meaningful. It was the long work of healing, learning that justice doesn't always look like a victory. Sometimes it looks like peace that stays. Now, when I talk to the women in our program, I tell them that truth has a rhythm. At first, it's sharp and uncomfortable, but eventually it steadies. It becomes something you can build a life around. My own truth began as a single sentence, one that finally broke the silence of a table where I had once felt small. From that moment on, I never needed to ask to be seen again. A few weeks later, I hosted a community dinner at the new center we'd built on my family's old property. We called it Harris Haven, just like Dad suggested. The space was open and bright, filled with laughter and the smell of fresh bread from the kitchen. Mom greeted guests at the door and Kara managed the volunteers. At one point, I stepped aside to watch the crowd, a room full of women celebrating each other, their voices strong and clear. It felt like coming full circle. Elaine found me near the back. "Look at this," she said, her voice full of quiet pride. "You've built something that won't end with you." I smiled, feeling the truth of that settle deep. "That's the goal," I said, "to make sure no one ever feels like I once did." She nodded, her eyes soft. "And you've done that, Stella, more than you know." When the night ended, I lingered after everyone left, walking the garden path Dad and I had helped plant earlier that spring. The air smelled of rain and honeysuckle. The stars were bright, scattered across a sky that had seen all my seasons, the quiet girl, the hidden one, the woman who finally took her place. I paused near the gate and looked back at the lights glowing through the windows. It struck me then how peace doesn't arrive all at once. It grows quietly and persistently until one day you realize you've been living inside it for a while. That's what this journey had become, not a story about proving anyone wrong, but about proving myself right. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that recognition doesn't have to be loud to be real. Sometimes the truest validation is the life you build when no one's watching. The strength to stand in your own story, unshaken, unapologetic, and finally at home in yourself. So to anyone listening who's ever felt overlooked or underestimated, remember this: your silence doesn't define you. What you build in that silence does. And if this story reminded you of your own journey, take a moment to share it or pass it on to someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes one quiet voice is enough to change the room.